Hey guys, it's Mike 1013 for FlopTurnRiver. Today I want to discuss floating the flop. Floating on the flop refers to calling a bet from your opponent with a very weak hand, not because you're getting odds or because you think it's likely that your hand's going to win at showdown, but rather because you think there's a high chance that your opponent will just check fold the turn, allowing you to pick up the pot. Being able to float successfully will enable you to contest more pots rather than giving up immediately, and it'll also make all your ranges a little bit harder to read. Now, because floating doesn't depend very much on the strength of your hand, but instead depends on observing your opponent's actions and taking advantage of opportunities that they give you, it's best done in position, so that on the turn you'll be able to see what your opponent does first before you even make any action. Much like any opponent-specific play, floating is best done in a heads-up pot. When you're facing multiple opponents, it's much less likely that you'll be able to call the flop and get them all to fold to a bet on the turn. There's too great a chance that someone either already has a good hand or will make a good hand by the turn for you to feel comfortable calling with air on the flop in the hopes that they all fold on the turn. Now, floating is a play that's good in very specific situations. You should by no means be liberally floating against all types of opponents. The best types of opponents to float against are those who c-bet the flop often, but don't follow up by barreling the turn very often. This allows you to call the flop, and then when they check the turn, you can bet and get a fold the majority of the time. Against players who do not c-bet often, it's inadvisable to float those times that they do c-bet. Since they're not c-betting all the time, when they do c-bet, they tend to have a good hand. So it's unlikely that they're going to c-bet the flop and then check fold the turn. So your float will have a hard time showing a profit in those circumstances. Against players who both c-bet often and follow up by betting on the turn often, floating becomes a very marginal play. The main advantage of floating is that your opponent is going to declare the strength of his hand on the turn, and then you'll be in a great position to take a lot of pots away from him. If he bets the turn often with a wide range, you won't be able to take advantage of this. You won't know when he has a monster and when he's just barreling light. So it's much more marginal to float against those players. When you do find an opponent against whom you can successfully float, you should choose to float with hands that do have some slight chance of making the best hand. So something like maybe a gutter plus an overcard, or two overcards and a backdoor flush draw. While the majority of your profits from floating will come from those times that you can take the pot away from your opponent, having extra ways to win always helps. Let's take a look at a few spots where we might consider floating against our opponent's c-bet. Okay, let me explain my HUD stats a little bit here. First number VPIP, second number PFR. On the next line there's c-bet percent, and in the pop-up there's 2 barrel percent. So let's get started here. The first hand happens at a 4 NL table, and there's a raise before us, and we have ace-jack suited, and we make the call, and everyone else folds. And here we see a flop of 9-8-3 rainbow. Let's look at our opponent's stats here. He seems to be a somewhat active player. I think he's on a moderately wide range, and his c-bet percent is 71%, so he's definitely c-betting a lot of the time that he misses. And let's take a look at his 2 barrel percent. His 2 barrel percent's only 14%. It is a very small sample size, but he has only c-bet the turn once in 7 opportunities. And we do have 2 overcards, a backdoor flush draw, and a backdoor straight draw. And our opponent bets, and I think given this type of player, that he's on a wideish range and that he's probably going to be giving up a lot of turns, combined with the fact that we do have a decent hand, I think this is a pretty good spot to float, and then on the turn we either can improve our hand or he can check to us and we can bet, and he's probably going to be folding the majority of the time. So I'd go ahead here and make the call. Okay, let's take a look at another hand. This hand happens at a 100 NL cash game. There's a raise in early position. We call on the button with Jack 10 suited, and everyone else folds. Now, let's take a look at this player. He seems tighter than the player from the previous hand. His PFR is only 7, and he's in earlier position. And if we look at his c-betting stat, it's 43%. So he's definitely not betting his whole range on the flop. Let's look at his 2-barrel stat. It's only 1 time out of 6 that he's 2-barreled. It is a small sample size. And that's the only favorable piece of information, is his 2-barrel percent. All the other information seems to argue against floating. His low c-bet percent, as well as the fact that he's in early position and has a low PFR. When he does check the turn, I don't think he's necessarily going to be check folding. He's probably going to be check calling a lot of the time. So if he does c-bet here, I think this is not a good spot for us to continue, even though we have overcards and a backdoor flush draw. So he does go ahead and c-bet. I recommend just folding here. I think his range is too strong, and it's very likely that a float will not be profitable. Thanks for watching. Remember to be selective about your floats. You only want to do it in the right situation against the right opponents. Later, guys.